Firespinner Chapter 11, The Day in Balance. As it turned out, nothing happened for most of the day. Roy was expecting Yosei sometime between dawn and mid-morning, the time when the sun was ascending, since he was supposedly tied to the primeval fire. But Thomas Blythe failed to appear. After mid-morning, they entered the time of balance, with the sun reaching apogee and slowly beginning its descent. Nothing happened then, either. As it turned out, things began about an hour before full dusk, when Thomas Blythe erupted out of the stream with no warning, flying over O'Hara's rampart with a good 3 feet to spare. He landed with a sizzling thud, his features shrouded by a billowing cloud of steam and rippling waves of heat. To his credit, in spite of the sudden arrival following a long wait, Reeds reacted instantly. A wall of shimmering red rectangles sprouted from a copper line on the ground, converging in a bronze talisman Reeds held aloft in his left hand. It was a crude ward, and started crumbling almost as soon as Thomas collided with it. Reeds held a bronze wand in his other hand, quickly connecting a pre-drawn set of glyphs to finish a more effective ward that spent flames and a thicker, stronger barrier in front of the possessed boy. O'Hara's earthworks rumbled as the tiles on her board clanked, ensorcelled tiles and sulfurite crystals sliding across it as she reworked the formation and, in the same action, rearranged the land itself. The raised earth by the creek began to sink back into the ground as a new barrier of equal thickness but greater height formed behind Reeds. But that wasn't the loudest noise at hand. At the other end of the hill, the massive trees at the foot of the cliff creaked to life and began to rip the cliffside apart. Rather than wait, Grunt and Marshall moved up to hack at the trees. The pines began to teeter and fall under their onslaught. But it ended almost as soon as it began, when a surge of water burst from the opening in the cliff and swept both men back down towards the crater. A small figure appeared at the new entrance in the cliffside and started towards the crater, flanked by the trees. Down in the center of the crater itself, the stones began to shift. Overhead, the clouds left from the previous day's rain began to roil and churn. "Nora!" Roy yelled. "Find the Nana-Wonota!" That was their first gambit. If the brothers had somehow co-opted Thomas and Andrew Blythe into playing out their old sibling rivalry, perhaps the grudge could be undercut by introducing Nora into the role of peacekeeper, as Yosei and Mete's mother had been between them. Old fathers considered it a long shot, but it was simple and easy to try, so Roy lined it up first. But it was anyone's guess whether Yosei and Mete would recognize Nora as their mother or not. So Grunt and Marshall moved to block Mete, and Reed started working on a third barrier, this one grounded in O'Hara's earthwork itself. Or at least, he started. Then he suddenly stopped and pivoted to look directly up the hill at the crater. Further up, Andrew Blythe did the same. In unison, both of them said, "Ket!" The word echoed over the hillside with preternatural clarity. Roy spoke no Sana, but he knew the word no when he heard it. He wasn't sure what circumstance made them say it, but he did know who was saying it. They were both under the influence of Mete now. That was a lovely little wrinkle he hadn't anticipated. Roy tapped Old Fathers on the shoulder. "Stop those trees, General." He grunted noncommittally. "Easier said than done." But he raised his hexwood staff up, its branches unfolding into a complicated pattern. The sulfurite crystals twined in the ends of its branches, pulsing with power. The general stretched his other hand towards the top of the hill in a clutching motion, and the raging pines shuddered to a stop. "Ket!" Andrew and Reed screamed in unison once more. They reached towards the trees with their hands and made a dragging motion. The pines shuddered as if under great strain. One shattered into splinters. The others lurched back into motion. "Dust and ashes," Roy whispered. He hadn't thought it possible Hezekiah Oldfathers could lose a contest of sheer power. "Coal-stoking son of ghosts!" Apparently the general hadn't expected it either. But he delayed the trees long enough for Marshall to get his feet, and charged back into the fray with surprising recklessness. His club whistled through the air and smashed into the trunk of one pine, which promptly shattered into flaming twigs. For a split second, Roy panicked, thinking the debris would land on Nora. But as they arced through the air, they were caught in the churning winds over the crater and went spinning away. "That doesn't look good, General," Roy yelled over the noise. "Looks like Yosei got to Marshall, too." So the brothers have all the brothers now, Old Fathers replied, his gestures waking some of the smaller trees, and sending them upslope as fast as the newly animated pines could go. Not that such little things posed much threat to the mature 60-foot trees under Mete's thumb. Pull O'Hara out. She can't be there when Reeds and Thomas start fighting for the brothers. I have something that will slow them down. You try and figure out what's happening in the crater. Ignis Fatus, man, I said. Tell me about all your tricks. But Roy was doing as Old Father said, holding his fist aloft with thumb upwards and jerking it over his shoulder in the Colombian Army's fall back signal. O'Hara stepped away from the waist-high board she set up by the river and kicked over a brazier she kept burning beside it all day. A cloud of viscous white smoke poured out of it and swept over the creek bed. Reeds and Thomas disappeared from view, though the fiery glow of Thomas' presence was still clearly visible inching up the hillside. Marshall just kept smashing trees with his club, but couldn't get anywhere near Andrew. For a moment, Roy feared the boy would reach his mother before anyone else could. Then one of the huge rocks by the crater shifted, lifted into the air on Grunt's shoulders, and flew towards Andrew at speed. Two of Andrew's pines leaped into the path of the missile. One was smashed flat to the ground. Grunt was already hefting another one of the huge rocks, weighing it for another throw. But Old Fathers was focused on the growing cyclone overhead. Roy, he yelled, I was right. There's something in that Nawonota. I don't know what part of the legend that is, but I don't think it's going to let the story end that easy. You have to keep Nora away from it. Roy's attention snapped back to the crater, where the Widow Blythe was tugging at a larger rock near the bottom of the pit. Her hair and dress whipped in the air, and her figure was half obscured by dirt and pine needles flying through the air. Roy gripped his buckler harder. Agreed. Keep the brothers away from the crater, but let them fight each other. I don't think that's the main show anymore. A brief flash of pale blue light caught Roy's attention. Old Fathers had drawn one of his fulminite crystals, leaned against the rock, and removed his peg leg. The top had a hollow just big enough for him to slip the crystal into. The general did so and held the peg back in place, vine-like tendrils around the top wrapping about the stump of his leg before he let his pants fall back into place. I'll take care of it. What are you doing? Roy asked. Cover your ears, Old Father replied. By the breath of Mercury, I am carried upon the primordial whirlwind. Roy understood what was happening a half-second before Old Fathers finished, barely getting his hands over his ears before a lightning bolt crashed down on the general. The world turned bright as day, and Roy felt the sound in his sternum. The sound repeated in a frightening staccato that nearly brought him to his knees. Flashes of lightning and blackened footprints tracking Old Father's path uphill to Mete and his trees. The walking groves strobed with light, and the trees were thrown in all directions, borne on waves of crackling lightning. Within their trunks, Roy saw images of the general, his legs transformed into pillars of lightning, lashing out against the trees, the ground, and the air itself. No wonder Old Fathers had kept that trick to himself. Many Colombians thought avatars of the first elements were blasphemous, after all. And this was a particularly terrifying blasphemy at that. There was no time to watch the carnage. Old Fathers fought a delaying action only, as the real battle took shape in the crater. A true whirlwind was forming over it, and Roy watched the sky with distrust as he approached Nora, unsure what he was looking for. At this point, they were past Gambit 2, where Nora tried to calm the boys once she had the Nawonota in hand, and on to the part where he should just stick iron into the thing and see if it canceled the magic at work. But Old Fathers was right. There was something in the Nawonota, and it didn't seem to be either of the brothers. That made everything less certain. As Roy got up to the crater, a towering pine tree loomed out of the chaos, but before it could do more than send a few roots stretching towards him, Grunt's axe crashed into its trunk, drawing the tree's attention. Roy scrambled down the crater, more than used to trusting Grunt to watch his back in these situations. The widow was saying something to him as he approached, but after the lightning strike, Roy couldn't hear much of anything. Once he realized he was partly deaf, Nora motioned like she was lifting the stone at her feet, a block of stone easily 2 feet tall and twice as long. Roy shook his head. Never mind that, he said. Or thought he said. He couldn't even hear himself. Something's off. Leave the coal-stoking thing and we'll move on to the next stage. Another series of flashes and rumbles, felt more than heard, drew Roy's attention long enough for him to note Old Fathers descending the slope again. O'Hara's fog had cleared and Thomas Blythe was coming up the hill again, only to stop short when he caught a crackling kick from the general. Roy winced but focused on the task at hand. He grabbed Nora by the shoulder and tried to pull her out of the crater. The wind caught her hair and tangled it around his arm, leaving it sopping wet. The day was overcast, but not rainy. Roy looked up, then down, then finally back at Nora, and realized that water was streaming from her hair in sheets. He looked back up into the sky, a sinking feeling in his stomach. The clouds were spinning in angry circles. It could have been Roy's imagination, but he thought he saw a face forming there. Nora, was it Nora? Was saying something, but Roy still couldn't hear her. But when he squatted down, put his shoulder into the rock, and pushed, Nora quickly joined him. A moment later, the rock shifted and rolled halfway over. Underneath was a simple octagonal frame of ivory and leather straps. Roy had never seen one, but it was obviously the Nawonota. He didn't hesitate for a moment when it came into view, just pulled all the fire he could from his buckler's sulfurite and blasted the old Sana artifact with it. A screaming blast of wind, loud enough that even Roy's ringing ears could hear it, tore down from the sky and plastered him flat. The blow left his head spinning and his ribs, which had been well behaved for the last day or so, throbbing once again. For a moment, Roy thought he saw something superimposed over the chaos of the real world. A woman in the garb of a Sana matron cowered, the Nawonota held up in both hands like a shield. A Sana man with cruel eyes loomed over her, hand raised to strike, but a bewildered look on his face. A stone axe was buried in his side, and a boy of no more than 12, whose face resembled the father he had just killed, held the weapon's handle. His identical twin watched from the entrance of the tent, horrified. The father's spirit was captured. As it strained against the Nawonota, the second brother went from horrified inaction to stealing the artifact and running away into the hills. Not all legends were true. If they were true, they were rarely the whole truth. And the legend of Yosei and Mete was apparently not one of the few that were the entire truth. No wonder Reeds and Marshall had never triggered the legend on their own. Their father was already dead, and it was clear the death of the father of the family started the story. The vision passed almost as soon as it came, leaving Roy to get to his feet in spite of his pain, old and new. Pain he could ignore. The Nawonota was another story. And the Sana artifact was on the move. The whirlwind that dispersed his fire blast also lifted the Nawonota into the air, dirt and dust swirling around it in an ominous cloud. Roy's buckler was mostly empty, and adding the small reserves of his cufflink and sword wasn't going to give him more firepower than a full buckler, so he changed tactics and drew his knife. Stepped in to slash at the relic, and got shocked in the leg before he got close. Electricity crackled through the dust cloud now, and, while dead iron would kill any magic it touched, it wasn't a defense for his entire body. Every time he tried to get closer to the artifact, the lightning snapped at him, leaving his limbs twitching and the distance the same. Roy backed away a step, growling in frustration. That was when he realized his hearing was coming back. Not that it had much to tell him. Nora was babbling in Sana now, another surprise victim of the legend. He hadn't expected it to be so all-encompassing, but if the vision he'd seen was true, and not just a fever dream, then her susceptibility to the legend's power wasn't surprising. A glance up and down the hill told him no one else was doing much better. Andrew Blythe was locked in battle with Marshall, much as their twin brothers fought down the slope. Nothing Grunt or O'Hara did fazed them, and only the fact that the mismatched twins were fighting each other with Old Fathers poking them as a spoiler slowed their advance on the crater. The power of the legend seemed to crackle all up and down the hillside like a living thing. And that was when Roy had it. All living things were a balance of 4 elements, and, of course, as a living thing, the legend was no exception. Mete was the element of earth, Yosei fire, their mother water, and their father air. Roy didn't have to kill the whole legend to win. He just had to rewrite it. Old Fathers! His voice was barely audible over the din of battle. New plan! Get front and center! Hopefully the general could hear better than Roy could. All he could do now was try and pave the way for Old Fathers. Roy pulled in every last drop of firepower from the sulfurite on his body and blasted it into the crackling dust storm, burning much of the dust away and decreasing the static in the air considerably. With a sharp click, Roy ejected the sulfurite from his falcata and crammed Old Father's fulminite crystal into the empty slot. It was a poor fit for the setting, not remotely the right size or shape, but with a little fumbling he got it to stay in place. Roy gave the weapon an experimental snap, saw that the fulminite stayed in place, and heaved the weapon at the Nabonota. It spun through the dust storm, the bright bronze blade crackling with electricity and channeling it down into the fulminite, draining even more power away from the gathering whirlwind, leaving a void in the legend. Roy looked around frantically. "General Oldfathers, get to the coal stoke!" The world went white, and sound flew away once again. For a moment, Roy saw the same family as before, now gathered around the fire, save for the father, who was just entering the tent, carrying a brace of rabbits over one shoulder. On closer inspection, he wasn't the same man as before. He was older, a little more world-weary, but his eyes were kind. Kinder than the father from before. Kinder than the man who led the trees up Briarheart. But unmistakable, nonetheless. Then the vision faded, and the real world crept back in at the edges. Grunt was helping Marshall to his feet. Nora was struggling against the buffeting wind, which seemed to be fading, but was still pretty strong. And Old Fathers was picking up the pieces of Roy's sword. He was holding the Nabonota in his other hand, still very much intact. Roy staggered over to him and held his hand out for the artifact. The general passed it to him, saying, "It looks inert, though I'm not sure that means it's safe." "What did you do?" "That was all you, General." He took the Nabonota and carefully cut the leather that bound it together with his iron dagger. "I agree with you on the safety issue, though. I know a safe place to keep the pieces for a while. In the meantime, let's get off this coal-stoking mountain." Firespinner is written, illustrated, and performed by Nate Chen.